What happens when a struggling restaurant owner makes one simple act of kindness?
A life-changing chain of events that could save not only his business, but an entire community. Stay tuned to see how this humble restaurant goes from barely surviving to thriving and discover the incredible power of love, sacrifice, and family. You won't believe the twist at the end. Don't forget to like, share, and hit that notification bell. This is a story you need to hear. It was the middle of winter, the kind of cold that cut through your bones, leaving you numb and desperate for warmth. The streets were empty, the snow falling gently but steadily, covering everything in a blanket of white. The kind of nightwear. Nothing seemed to matter except the cold and the hunger gnawing at you. But for Darius Carter, the restaurant owner of Carter's Kitchen, it was just another night filled with debt, disappointment, and the crushing weight of failure. Inside the small, dimly lit restaurant, Darius sat hunched over a pile of unpaid bills, his father's old knife resting beside the papers like an old friend, a constant reminder of everything he was about to lose. Carter's Kitchen had once been a thriving place, loved by locals, known for its hearty meals and the warmth of its service. But now, it seemed as if it was destined to become just another forgotten place in a world dominated by fast food chains and mass production. Darius felt the heavy weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him. His father had built the restaurant from the ground up, pouring his heart and soul into it. But now, with the bills piling up, the phone calls from suppliers sopping, and no customers walking through the door, Darius wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. He picked up the knife, running his fingers over the worn handle. "I've let you down, Pops," he whispered to the empty restaurant. "I've let this place die." A single tear rolled down his cheek as he stared at the knife. It wasn't just a knife, it was a symbol of everything that had come before him, everything that had been built with love, with hard work. It was his inheritance, his responsibility. And now, it seemed as though he was about to lose it all. The silence in the restaurant was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the corner. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the streets in an icy layer. Fast food chains had slowly strangled his business until Carter's Kitchen was just a distant memory of a time when families came together to enjoy a meal, not just grab something on the go. Darius locked the door, stepping out into the cold, wondering if tomorrow he'd still have keys to turn. But as he made his way down the empty street, he saw something that would change everything. At the corner of Beacon Avenue, two figures huddled against a brick wall, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The wind howled through the empty street, cutting through their thin clothing like a knife. The elderly woman clutched a small boy to her chest, both of them shivering uncontrollably. Darius slowed his pace, recognizing something in their desperate embrace, the shape of people with nowhere left to go. "Grandma, I'm cold," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible in the freezing air. Darius froze. The words seemed to hang in the air, their fragility cutting straight through him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the two figures. The woman, her face weathered by time and hardship, seemed as though she had given up on hope long ago. The boy, too young to understand the depth of their struggle, flung to her for warmth, his small body trembling with every breath. Darius felt something shift within him, a crack in the armor he had built around his own pain. He had been struggling for months, barely holding on. But these two had nothing. They had no home, no food, no warmth. And he had a restaurant, a place that could offer them at least one of those things. He took a step toward them, his boots crunching against the ice, his breath visible in the air. "You don't have to be out here tonight," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I own that place right there," he said, pointing toward Carter's Kitchen, the neon sign flickering in the distance. "It's closed, but I can still make something hot for you. Both of you can come in, warm up." The woman's eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing in her gaze. She pulled the boy closer to her, as though afraid to trust a stranger. "We don't need charity," she murmured, her voice proud, defiant. Darius exhaled slowly, his breath curling into the cold night air. He wanted to argue, to tell her that it wasn't charity, it was just decency, humanity. But before he could speak, the boy stirred, his wide eyes flicking between his grandmother and Darius. And then, in a voice full of quiet desperation, the boy spoke again. "Please, Grandma, I'm so cold." The woman's resolve cracked. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded ever so slightly. It was enough. Without another word, Darius extended his arm and led them across the street, unlocking the door to Carter's Kitchen. The warmth of the restaurant spilled out, a refuge against the night's chill. He guided them to a booth near the heater, and then, without thinking, he slipped into the kitchen. His hands moved on autopilot, chopping, stirring, and heating broth. It was the rhythm of survival he had known too well, an instinct, not a thought. Minutes later, he returned to the booth, carrying 2 steaming bowls of soup.
The boy's eyes lit up, and he eagerly grabbed the spoon, slurping it down as though he hadn't eaten in days.
The woman hesitated at first, but then she took a cautious sip. Her eyes closed, and she exhaled softly. "It's good," she whispered. Darius leaned against the counter, watching them eat. For the first time that night, he felt something release inside him. The weight he had been carrying seemed to lift, even if just for a moment. But as the bowls emptied and the silence returned, Darius knew what had to be done. Sending them back into the cold would be like sentencing them to death. "There's a storage room behind the kitchen," he said quietly. "There's a couch, some blankets. Not much, but it's warmer than the street. Stay here tonight." The woman's eyes filled with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to refuse, but the boy tugged at her sleeve, his eyes pleading. She swallowed hard and nodded once. "Thank you," she whispered. The next morning, Darius returned to Carter's kitchen, expecting to find the same mess he had left behind. But when he opened the door, he froze. The restaurant was spotless. Every chair was neatly tucked beneath the tables. The windows, once clouded with grime, gleamed in the morning sunlight. Even the counter, where bills had piled up like a curse, was clear paper stacked neatly in piles. The floor looked as though it had been scrubbed down to the very last inch. Darius stepped inside, his breath caught in his throat. This was not how he had left it. He set his keys down slowly, his rough fingers brushing against the counter. From the back room, he could hear the soft rustling of fabric and the faint voice of the boy. He walked toward the storage room, his boots sounding heavy against the clean floor. When he pushed open the door, he saw them. The old woman was on her knees, folding rags with steady hands. Beside her, the boy sat on a stool, his small legs swinging, his head bent over a scrap of paper. The boy looked up the moment he saw Darius, his face lighting up with a wide grin. "Look," the boy cried, holding the paper out with both hands. "We cleaned everything." Eleanor, the grandmother, rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. Her eyes met Darius's, steady and unflinching. "You gave us a roof," she said softly. "The least we could do is treat it with respect." Darius stepped closer and took the paper from the boy. It was a drawing of Carter's kitchen, but not the one he knew. The boy had imagined it alive again. The windows glowed with warm light. The door was wide open, and the tables inside were full of people, all smiling as they ate. Above the door, a banner spelled out the name of the restaurant. In uneven letters, Carter's Kitchen. In the corner, 3 small figures stood together at the entrance. A man, an old woman, and a boy. For a moment, Darius couldn't speak. He looked at the picture, then at the boy's hopeful eyes, and finally at Eleanor's face, which held both pride and defiance. He felt something stir deep inside him, a flicker of hope, fragile but real. That's not bad, kid," Darius said, his voice rough. "Not bad at all." The boy grinned wide, his chest puffing out like he had just been awarded a medal. Eleanor's lips curved faintly, a smile that seemed to belong to someone who hadn't smiled in a long time. Darius turned quickly, grabbing a dish towel to cover the sting in his eyes. He busied himself at the counter, but inside, a fragile ember of hope began to take root. He had felt it before, but never this strong. Carter's kitchen wasn't just his father's dream anymore. It was something new, something alive. The peace, however, was short-lived. That afternoon, the debt collector arrived. His knock at the door was sharp, deliberate, and filled with authority. Darius stood at the door, bracing himself for what he knew was coming. The man, flanked by 2 others, stepped inside without waiting. "This place looks cleaner than your books, Carter," the man sneered, his eyes scanning the room, judging, mocking. "Funny how you can keep a floor shining, but not your accounts." Darius didn't respond. He couldn't. The words, the shame, the fear, all of it was building inside him, threatening to overflow. He just stood there, silent, his fists clenched. The man smirked and leaned in closer. 2 weeks, he said, his voice casual, but his eyes were hard. "Get me my money, or this place isn't yours anymore." The man tapped his knuckles on the counter, turned, and walked out. His boots crunched in the snow, and the door slammed shut behind him. Darius stood still for a moment, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The weight of the words pressed down on him, behind him. Eleanor stepped into the doorway, her eyes sharp, noticing the way Darius's hands trembled. The boy peeked out from behind her, his face pale with worry. "Who was that, Mr. Carter?" the boy asked softly. Darius turned to him, forcing a smile.
"Don't worry about it," he said gently. "It's nothing you need to think about." But the boy didn't buy it.
He looked up at Darius, searching his face, trying to understand. Eleanor said nothing, but her eyes carried a heavy truth. Darius took a deep breath and forced himself
to move, grabbing a dish towel from the counter, trying to shake off the tremors in his hands.
It wasn't just fear, it was a mixture of everything.
Fear, shame, anger.
The restaurant was slipping through his fingers, and the people he cared
about most were caught in the middle. But as Darius stood there, he realized something.
This wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about the people he had found here, the family that had come together through the most unlikely of circumstances. It wasn't about money or success or debt. It was about love, and for the first time in months, Darius felt something different inside him. It wasn't relief.
It wasn't joy.
It was hope. And sometimes hope is all you need to start over. The next day, Darius stood behind the counter of Carter's kitchen, staring at the stack of bills he had pushed aside once again. He had 2 weeks to come up with the money or lose everything. But as he stared at the stack, his eyes drifted to the picture the boy had drawn. Carter's kitchen, alive again, full of people, full of life. That vision clung to him harder than the threat of losing everything. What if he could turn
it all around?
What if he could make it work? And so he began to prepare more food than he had in months. Roasted chicken, cornbread, and the kind of meals that had once filled the restaurant with the warmth of family. By late morning, Darius, Eleanor, and Ethan stood outside the front door, offering free samples to anyone who walked by. It was a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, someone would stop, taste the food, and remember what real meals were like. As the hours dragged by, Darius's hope began to fade.
But then a miracle happened. People stopped. 81st. It was 1, then 2, then more. They tasted the food, they smiled, and slowly the restaurant began to fill.
Word of mouth spread, and by the time evening came, Carter's kitchen had more
customers than it had seen in months. But more than that, it had something else.
It had hope. As the evening drew to a close, Darius looked around at the restaurant. It was filled with laughter, with stories being shared, with people who had once been strangers now becoming part of the community. Carter's kitchen wasn't just a place to eat anymore.
It was a place to belong, and in that moment, Darius knew something he had never known before.
Success wasn't just about money.
It wasn't about fame or recognition.
It was about love. It was about creating a space where people could come together, share a meal, and find a sense of belonging. Carter's kitchen was more than just a restaurant. It was a family. And for the first time in a long time, Darius believed it was exactly what it was meant to be. This is a story of how one man's kindness led to a community finding each other and finding love.
It's proof that even in the most desperate times, hope can still shine through.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.
And remember, the best families, like the best restaurants, are built one meal, one moment, and one act of love at a time.